So the positions on terms of even what a ceasefire means are not close to one another. And I think there's only a very slim chance that it will be implemented. It also means providing healthcare and humanitarian services to the population. None of these are in the American plan. Americans are only thinking about the ceasefire itself as an end. I would say that President Raisi's death does not impact the direction of Iran's foreign policy. Somebody like Larijani or Ghalibaf would become Iran's president.
Does the Biden administration try to avoid a new crisis with Iran?
The Biden administration's interest is that Iran does not enrich more uranium than it has, but also it really wants to create an Arab-Israeli alliance against Iran. The Saudis are no longer interested in that kind of an alliance because they have found a formula to managing their relations with Iran, which includes China as well in it. All the countries in the world together, all 171, 72 of them cannot have an influence on Israel. There's only one country that has influence on Israel, but of the three great powers, China, Russia, and the United States, the Arab world and the Muslim world managed to get at least two of them. And I don't think the US will withdraw from Iraq or Syria now. In fact, I expect that they will try to increase the size of their presence. Ukraine war is moving in Russia's direction. My expectation is that Russia will try to come back to Syria. That reality is that we now have Iran, Russia, and China forming a Eurasian landmass.
Merhabalar efendim, ben Doktor Esra Karayindiba. Harici.com.tr'nin YouTube kanalını izliyorsunuz. Bugün Orta Doğu'daki gelişmeleri, Gazze'yi, İran'daki seçimleri, Türkiye'nin Kuzey Irak'ta beklenen terörle mücadele harekatlarını konuşmak üzere ABD'den kıdemli bir ismi ağırlıyoruz. Johns Hopkins Üniversitesi öğretim üyesi, aynı zamanda ABD Dışişleri Bakanlığı eski baş danışmanı Profesör Vali Nasr konuğumuz oluyor. Professor Nasr, thank you very much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
All around the world now, Gaza is a top issue because people are expecting a ceasefire. President Biden has just proposed a ceasefire with 3 stages, but at the same time, Israeli attacks to Palestinians in Rafah continues, and a White House spokesperson told that they don't see it as a military operation. So there's so many different parameters. How can this ceasefire plan be implemented in this equation?
I agree with you that there's a lot of focus on the ceasefire, and it's absolutely necessary in order to calm the situation and end the humanitarian disaster in Gaza. But I don't see it being practical at this stage because Israel's position is that it wants at best, a temporary ceasefire so that it gets the hostages released, and then it wants to return to war. And the right wing of the current government in Israel doesn't even want a temporary ceasefire. It wants to just continue the war, and it argues that it wants to release the hostages through war. On the other hand, Hamas wants a permanent ceasefire. In other words, it wants the ceasefire to be the beginning of the end of the war. So the positions on terms of even what a ceasefire means are not close to one another. And I think there's only a very slim chance that it will be implemented.
On the other hand, the ceasefire plan which President Biden proposes do not offer a post-ceasefire administration in Gaza. What is the U.S. position of them? Because Israel doesn't want even one member of Hamas to stay in Gaza. But without Hamas, is it possible to think of an administration in Gaza even after a ceasefire or post-war?
Right. I think you put your finger on a very important issue. Everybody in the region is thinking not just about the ceasefire, but also about the day after ceasefire. Day after ceasefire means providing security to the population, policing. It means providing services from healthcare, education, garbage collection. It also means providing healthcare and humanitarian services to the population. None of these are in the American plan. Americans are only thinking about the ceasefire itself as an end, but nothing about what happens after the ceasefire. And that's, again, another reason why the current ceasefire is the idea that it could be implemented and implemented successfully is very difficult to see happen.
What about this two-state solution story? Can we still talk about that?
Well, currently the Israeli position is that it does not accept the two-state solution. The majority of Israeli population are not supporting it, and the current government in Israel has said very clearly that it will not accept a two-state solution. It never supported it, according to Prime Minister Netanyahu. And one of the most important coalition partners of Prime Minister Netanyahu is committed to annexing the West Bank completely into Israel. So therefore, the idea of a two-state solution is not shared across the board. It's an idea that the Americans, many Arab countries, and many Palestinians agree to, but not Israel. And then what does this two-state solution mean? It probably is no longer feasible along the lines of the Oslo process, because too many settlements have been built in Israel. And if there is to be a two-state solution, one has to think creatively of having kind of a shared sovereignty on the West Bank, where the populations continue to exist next to each other without settlements being withdrawn, without Palestinian necessarily gaining or losing any more territory, but that there would be certainly some kind of a Palestinian sovereignty intermixed with Israeli sovereignty. But we're still very far from these ideas, because we cannot even get it to a ceasefire, let alone to the idea of a two-state solution.
Okay, yes, of course, Gaza is the most important issue in the region, but we have some other headlines too. Iran has lost its top leaders, the President Raisi and Foreign Chief Abdullahian, besides so many bureaucrats. So how do you see the post-Raisi period in Iran, and what are your expectations from the presidential elections, which are going to be held in June 28th? And according to you, who is the strongest candidate, and how can the results of these presidential elections can affect Iran's foreign policy?
President Raisi's most important role was domestic. He was there to manage the economy, stabilize the country, improve the conditions of the people, particularly after the protests that Iran went through. He did not have a big role in foreign policy. He didn't have a background in foreign policy. He didn't have very strong foreign policy views. His foreign minister was very important in opening relations between Iran and the neighbors, from Azerbaijan and Saudi Arabia and UAE. But his policies have now become basically accepted across the board in Iran as Iran's policies. I would say that President Raisi's death does not impact the direction of Iran's foreign policy, not on Gaza, not in the region, not vis-a-vis the United States or vis-a-vis the nuclear issue. Its most important impact is domestic. There was significant amount of unhappiness with President Raisi's administration, and it was already building up in anticipation of next year's presidential elections in June of 2025. So the key issue is whether the team that was around President Raisi is able to hold on to the presidency. And I find that difficult because they do not have a very strong candidate, other than perhaps the former president, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who has now registered to run. But there is also a significant push, even at the very top in Iran, about bringing in a much more competent and experienced and more moderate presidency, a more moderate conservative with experience who can stabilize the domestic politics in Iran. And we have some big names that have now registered, including a former Speaker of the Parliament and senior statesman, Ali Larijani. There's potential for the head of the parliament in Iran, Ghalibaf, who was mayor of Tehran as well, to run. And I think we will only know what the shape of the presidential election is after the Guardian Council looks at all of these applications and decides which ones it's going to approve and which ones it's going to reject. For instance, in Iran, there is great expectation that President Ahmadinejad's candidacy will not be approved. It was not approved last time, and it will not be approved again, that the supreme leader is not going to put up with his theatrics, and that was a problem for him when Ahmadinejad was president. My own expectation is that we're going to have a shift to the more middle, still a conservative president, but a more pragmatic conservative, somebody like Larijani or Ghalibaf, who becomes Iran's president. They are better positioned to manage domestically, but these people are also likely to be bigger voices in Iran's foreign policy, on U.S. relations with America, on Gaza, on regional issues, just by virtue of their experience and also by the virtue of their standing. They're more likely to try to influence Iran's foreign policy the way, for instance, that President Rouhani did.
Is it stated that European countries wanted to condemn Iran at the meeting of the International Atomic Energy Agency, but the Biden administration tried to block this initiative in the presence of European countries? Does the Biden administration try to avoid a new crisis with Iran?
Yes, he's trying to avoid a crisis with Iran. But the Biden administration's policy over the past year has to be to reduce tensions in the Middle East as a whole, to focus on Ukraine and to focus on China and to focus on elections. October 7th presented the US with an unwelcome amount of interest and activity in the Middle East for the administration. And they got very, very worried when Iran and Israel came very close to direct confrontation in the first 10, 12 days of the month of April over exchange of missiles and the attack on Iran's consulate in Damascus. The Biden administration's interest is that Iran does not enrich more uranium than it has, that it does not escalate with Israel, that it does not escalate attacks on American personnel in Syria and Iraq, and it does not want to generate a crisis. Europeans, on the other hand, are proceeding along a different line. But in many ways, Europe is out of all kinds of engagement with Iran after the position they took on the protest, after the fact that they have basically broken all economic relations with Iran altogether. And based on the fact that Iran understands that Europe really does not have an independent foreign policy when it comes to Iran and the Middle East from the United States. Ultimately, the US is the decision maker. That Iranians basically are focused on their talks with the US, not with the Europeans. So a few days before President Raisi died, there was a meeting in Oman between the most senior Middle East person at the White House, Brett McGurk, and the deputy foreign minister of Iran at the time, who's now in charge of the foreign ministry, Mr. Bagheri Kani. And agreements were made about de-escalation in the region, on the nuclear issue, on Gaza, on Israel, and on Iraq and Syria. And the United States basically wants to abide by that agreement that was made in Oman, and the Europeans were not part of that agreement in Oman.
So the Biden administration is trying to balance its presence in the Middle East by bolstering relations with Saudi Arabia at the same time, by including this Israel in the equation, leaving Iran issue aside. How do you interpret this policy? So you have Saudi Arabia and Israel to balance and trying to avoid the crisis with Iran?
Well, the relations between Iran and Saudi Arabia have improved drastically over the last year. And that basically serves the Biden administration's interest of having no major crisis in the region. Now, they had hoped before October 7th that by creating normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia, they would also create a much broader arena for peace in the region. The problem here is that, first of all, Israel does not want to give anything to Saudi Arabia on the Palestinian issue. And in the current environment, after October 7th, after Gaza war, after 40, 50,000 Palestinians being killed, after all the pictures that the Arab world is seeing or the Turkish people are seeing on a daily basis about Gaza, it's not easy for Saudi Arabia to recognize Israel and normalize relations without getting something very big from Israel, which means ceasefire and a very credible path to two-state solution. And Israel doesn't want to give that. So that is stuck. On the other hand, Israel really wants normalization with Saudi Arabia just for legitimacy purposes, to say that it has been able to build relations with all the Arab countries, the most important Muslim country, which has Mecca and Medina in it, without giving anything to the Palestinians. But also it really wants to create an Arab-Israeli alliance against Iran. The Saudis are no longer interested in that kind of an alliance because they have found a formula to managing their relations with Iran, which includes China as well in it, and relations are stable. They don't want to create an Israeli-Arab NATO and then be the frontline state confronting an angry Iran. And so the strategic objectives of Israel and Saudi Arabia in this deal are not the same. As far as the United States is concerned, yes, there is domestic political advantage for the Biden administration before the election to be able to claim that it has created this peace between Israel and Saudi Arabia. But also the issue of America and Saudi Arabia has a lot more to do, I think, with China than it has to do with Iran. Because this is a very close strategic partnership between Saudi Arabia and the United States would basically close the door to many kinds of investments, particularly in technology and other things, by the Chinese in Saudi Arabia. And so there is a different kind of a strategic logic for the United States in this deal, which is suggestive of the fact that the American-Chinese rivalry is arriving in the Middle East in a much bigger way than it had before.
Yes, if we consider the Chinese leadership visit to Saudi Arabia without prior notice to Iran, so it was something very unexpected. And even during this Gaza crisis, when Israel first attacked Gaza, all Middle Eastern countries, Arab countries, wanted to bring China in. What do you think? At the first, in the first phase, Arabs wanted to bring China in, hoping that China could bring a solution. But now we see that it's how many months passed? More than maybe it's almost more than 8 months. The Israeli assault is going on in Gaza, but we see nothing from China too.
I don't think anybody expected that the Chinese could solve anything. To solve this issue, you have to have both sides. You have to have influence on both sides. There's no country that has influence on Israel other than the United States. And even that is now showing itself to be not much of an influence. The idea that the Chinese could persuade the Israelis to change their policy was never realistic at all. The Chinese are influential on Iran. The Chinese are influential on Saudi Arabia. They could have played the role of an honest broker between them when both countries actually wanted a solution. And also that the Chinese did have influence on both countries and could move the ball. So no, I don't think there is any country. In fact, if you put all the countries in the world together, all 171, 72 of them cannot have an influence on Israel. There's only one country that has influence on Israel. And nowadays, in fact, it looks like Israel has more influence on America than America has influence on Israel. So there is no outside force that actually can have a say. But what it matters is that the Chinese diplomatically supported the Arab position. At the United Nations, they support the Arab position. And that basically helped isolate Israel more. So of the three great powers, China, Russia, and the United States, the Arab world and the Muslim world managed to get at least two of them, China and Russia, to unequivocally support the Arab position.
Okay, let's talk about the U.S. withdrawal, the expected withdrawal from Iraq. So there's still thousands of U.S. soldiers in Iraq, yes, and can we interpret the delay in this withdrawal as stalling? And how do you evaluate the claim that there's a group in Iraq who actually doesn't want the U.S. to step back?
There definitely are groups in Iraq that don't want the U.S. step back, including the Kurds in the north, including also some elements in the Iraqi government, as well as even the central government in Iraq that does not want the United States to withdraw from Iraq. And I don't think the U.S. will withdraw from Iraq or Syria now. In fact, I expect that they will try to increase the size of their presence, because a lot of their presence in the past had to do first with fighting ISIS, and then it had to do with basically trying to contain Iran's position on the ground in both Iraq and especially in Syria. In fact, in Syria, I think American presence is no longer about ISIS. I think that's more of an excuse. It's really there to try to break up a linkage from Iran to Lebanon going through Syria. Now, given that Iran launched all of these missiles that flew over Iraq and is building missile capabilities in Syria as well, it is now unlikely that the United States will withdraw from those territories and let Iraq and Syria become very easily bases for Iranian operations against Israel. And that's what I'm saying. I think actually they will likely try to expand their presence in Syria and in Iraq. All of those air defense systems that shot down Iranian drones and missiles, the Americans will want them to stay in Syria and Iraq. And then the other issue is that now that the Ukraine war is moving in Russia's direction, my expectation is that Russia will try to come back to Syria. And as we're seeing an escalation where the Russians are attacking Kharkiv, the Americans are now allowing missiles given by, or anti-aircraft missiles that are given to Ukraine to be used against Russia, inside Russia. The Russians may very well try to expand their footprint in Syria as a way of putting pressure on the Americans. So I think Syria and Iraq are now no longer about just terrorism and Syria and Iraq. They're about the larger issues of Russia and Iran. And there is a bigger strategic justification for the United States to stay in place.
Yeah, you opened up Northern Iraq issue. I'll come to that. But while talking about Israel, while reminding our audience Iran's aerial attack to Israeli side, we still did not have a response from Israel. Is it pending or?
No, I think Israel did respond. They shot a missile at a military base in Isfahan in central Iran, which was very close to nuclear facilities, which was deep inside Iran. It probably was launched from an F-35 fighter on the border of Iraq and Iran. And I think the United States worked very hard to make sure Israel will not do much more. So it did give a response. I think both countries, both Iran and Israel, showed their ability to attack the other one, showed willingness to attack the other one, but they did not want to actually escalate into a full war at this point in time.
Yes, so I didn't consider that because it's not considered as a big response because Israeli leadership was speaking very big words how to take the revenge from Iran. So,
well, I mean, Iranians also spoke very big words, and they decided, yes, they launched 300 missiles, but they decided to launch them from Iran. They telegraphed they were coming. They actually told the United States, and indirectly they told Israel through Egypt when the launch was beginning. It took 6 hours for the attack to arrive on Israeli borders, which gave ample time to U.S. and Israel to prepare to shoot them down. So I think that Iran's intention was not necessarily to do something that would start a bigger war, but was to basically show Israel that, look, we're no longer going to take it. If you punch us in the face, now we're going to punch you back. Previously, you did it. You assassinated people. You attacked nuclear facilities. We didn't attack directly. And the Israelis did not launch a massive attack, but the attack that they launched was significant because they basically hit a target with fewer missiles, but deep inside Iran, in the middle of Iran and very close to nuclear facilities. So if they were going to send a message as well, that message was sent, that they have the capability to to hit Iran in ways that could be very effective. So this is clearly has moved the line between the two countries significantly closer to direct attack on one another.
Yes, our time is about to be up, but I have two more questions. So we have entered the new period in which Turkey has said we're going to clear all terrorist elements in northern Iraq in this summer. So given the fact that the US has still thousands of soldiers there and supporting the elements which Ankara sees as terrorists, both in Syria and northern Iraq, how can, do you think there will be a clash between the US and Turkey because of Ankara's anti-terror operations in the summer to northern Iraq, as it happened in the past?
It's possible. It's difficult to tell. It depends on how deeply the Turks go, how long it takes, and how aggressive they're going to go after the Kurdish elements. But the danger is that depending on the American reaction and whether or not they actually end up confronting one another.
Okay. And let's also talk about the US elections. So after some months, they're going to have in November, and Trump was found guilty in the harsh manner case. What will happen next? How will this decision affect Trump's campaign? And how will the latest trends in the country, including the Gaza massacre, be reflected on the ballot boxes in the US presidential elections?
Well, we're in a completely new territory. I mean, early indications is that those who support Trump continue to support Trump, and President Biden has not yet got a boost from this conviction. But we shall see as time passes what happens, and whether or not there are some independents who basically change their mind about the election because of Trump. The problem is that President Biden is facing his own problems with the economy, with popularity, with age, but also the Gaza war is angering an important constituency within the Democratic Party, which is deeply unhappy with him and with his policies on Gaza. And that's the younger people, the progressive people, many among the minorities. It's not known whether in the end they do vote for him or they decide not to vote at all. But that's all. Clearly, the Gaza war is having an impact on the elections.
But you don't have one option better than the other. Talking about the candidates.
That's the problem. That's exactly the problem. That's why it's so unpredictable. You have two very, very unpopular candidates, both of them very old. People in America across the board are not happy with these choices. But how people react to two bad choices is not easy to predict because there's not enormous amount of enthusiasm outside of the core base for either one. So you cannot say that people are voting enthusiastically for Trump or enthusiastically for Biden. And the question is which is going to be more unpopular, and whether a larger number of people decide not to vote at all rather than to vote for one or the other.
Okay, Professor Nasr, my last question. I read an article in The National Interest. It was analyzing the rising Turkish influence on the Turkic region, the Central Asia and the South Caucasus. The writer resembled Turkey's impact like Ruski Mir, like the world of Russia, as it was in the Soviet period. So as far as I understand, the US has its eyes on Turkey and what's happening in the Turkic world. And the analysis included the fact that organizational Turkic states has a lot of importance and is gaining its important role, especially after the Russia-Ukraine war, because the Middle Corridor, and it can be the part to China's Belt and Road project. How do you think that the US foreign policy can give Turkey much more significance than in the past, considering that Turkey has a great role in the region?
That the United States may very well want that. I mean, Turkey's relationships with the Turkic world are both cultural and increasingly also economic, and in that sense, it's different from the Soviet Union. But at the same time, in Central Asia and the Caucasus, the issue is increasingly that Russia, China, and Iran, all countries that are now at odds with the United States under various kinds of sanctions, don't see their interest in having any kind of an American presence in that area. So Turkey can expand its influence in Central Asia and the Caucasus, either by working with Russia and China and Iran or working against them. And those are very different dynamics, because the interests of the United States, Russia and China and Iran are very different. I mean, today, Turkey is still one of Russia's biggest trading partners. But that's not as an agent of the United States trying to help US influence. It's basically defying Europe and the US by maintaining its ties to the East with Russia. So my sense is that Turkey will be very important in the Turkic world, but its influence will be greatest if it's not at war with Russia, China, and Iran, but actually is integral to the kind of geoeconomic reality that is emerging in the western part of Asia, and then it's extending all the way back to East Asia.
And what is that? And what is the now emerging?
With that reality is that we now have Iran, Russia, and China forming a Eurasian landmass. All of them are at odds with the US. Two most important West Asian part are under massive sanctions. And China is also increasingly under massive sanctions. And they basically look at Central Asia and Caucasus as part of that Eurasian landmass. And they don't welcome America trying to poke its finger in the middle of that. And yes. So what we're going to see is this reality. I mean, Turkey already has very tight relations with Russia and Iran, trade relations. And it can expand that into Central Asia and the Caucasus. But I don't believe as a tool of American foreign policy that will work.
Okay. Professor Vali Nasr, thank you very much. You're joining me from Washington, right?
Thank you.
It's very early there. Good morning to you. Değerli izleyenler, size de çok teşekkür ederiz izlediğiniz için. Hoşça kalın.